Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kingston Yacht Club, and welcome to our Nautical Nights presentation series. My name is not Dr. Michelle Clarabut. I am Dan Rose. I'm the Collections and Programs Assistant at the Great Lakes Museum, and I'm very excited to welcome you all here to our presentation this evening. This is, I believe, our fourth season of Nautical Nights, so this has been a fantastic opportunity to share in the different elements of the histories that you find here in Kingston and above. Oh, thank you kindly, Michelle. And which leads itself to our land and water acknowledgement. See, the waterways and land associated with the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history that predate the establishment of European settlers and are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of the indigenous peoples. Together providing a network of trade and travel throughout the time immemorial. The Great Lakes Museum at Kingston, or Cataraqui, acknowledges that the site it sits on and the water it interacts with are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship over the land and water, but we are also committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. Now, once again, thank you and welcome to this evening. A few housekeeping notes. As I'm sure you're aware, work continues aboard the SS Keewatin as we prepare for our first season of guided tours on board that magnificent vessel. It's not often that here in Kingston we have very many lasts, but the last Edwardian steamship liner is one of those pieces. So we're very excited for this upcoming summer season. We hope to see you all there attending one of our tours. Beyond that, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Scott Berthelette. Now, Scott is an assistant professor of history at Queen's University, and attendees may recall that Scott is actually a Nautical Nights alumna. He presented previously where he discussed France's quest for the Western Sea and its impact on the indigenous communities in the Great Lakes watershed. Tonight, we return to the nexus of French and indigenous history under Scott's guidance. So please join me in welcoming Scott to the frontier.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dan, and it's a great pleasure to be back. I think it was 2 years ago that I presented at one of the Nautical Nights talk. So it's great to be back and to be presenting on a different research project. This is a new research project that I started about, I guess, last April when I did a preliminary research trip to France and the UK to begin gathering data for this particular project, which I'm very happy to share with you all today. So let me know if I need to talk more directly into the mic or not, but otherwise I hope it's picking up. So the story I want to tell this evening begins in June of 1687. And it begins right here at Cataraqui, or Fort Frontenac, where the French had established a fort back in 1673. But I'll begin in 1687. At this time, the Governor General of New France, a man named Jacques-René de Brizay de Denonville, was gathering an army in preparation for war against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whom the French would have called the Iroquois. Governor Denonville's forces were mustering here at Cataraqui, this strategic location where the St. Lawrence River, the Cataraqui River, and Lake Ontario meet. And it was here that, as I was mentioning, that Fort Frontenac was indeed constructed a few years earlier, back in 1673. Denonville's 1687 invasion was meant to deliver a crippling blow to the westernmost nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Seneca, which the French hoped would subdue the entire Confederacy. Before the invasion even began, however, Denonville and his military officers captured and arrested hundreds of Haudenosaunee men, women, and children from various communities along the north shore of Lake Ontario, who at that time didn't even know they were at war with the French. A peaceful delegation of about 40 Haudenosaunee arriving from Onondaga, the capital of the Confederacy in Upper New York State, were also arrested under the false pretenses of a feast meant to solidify peace and commerce with the French. So this seizure was indeed a betrayal by a supposedly friendly and allied nation. Out of the Haudenosaunee prisoners, 36 men were transported down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, where they were subsequently shipped to France and forced into servitude and slavery on King Louis XIV's Mediterranean galleys at Marseille in the south of France. These 36 Haudenosaunee galley slaves would unwillingly cross the Atlantic through the French port of Rochefort and then onto Marseille, where they rode in the Sun King's galley fleet throughout the Mediterranean Sea for a number of years. My presentation today, as well as the overall project I've been working on, centers on the fate and experience of these 36 Haudenosaunee captives, some of whom would eventually make it back to their homes in North America. So first, though, I want to step back and give a bit of context on the Haudenosaunee, who, as I was saying, you might know as the Iroquois Confederacy or the Five or Six Nations Iroquois, but I will be using the term Haudenosaunee today. So at some point prior to European contact, 5 separate nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, came together to form a confederacy. They had been united by the great peacemaker and his disciple Hiawatha, and they established the Great Law of Peace and formed their confederacy. So this might be a familiar history for some here. The traditional homeland of the Haudenosaunee are the lands between the Mohawk River Valley in the east and the Genesee Valley in the west, and this is all in Upper New York State. But of course now the Haudenosaunee homelands have grown as the centuries have gone on, and we have Haudenosaunee communities in Ontario and Quebec as well. The self-designation of Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, and this term is becoming more commonly used than older European applied names like Iroquois. The Haudenosaunee not only lived in multi-family bark longhouses, but they also likened their entire confederacy to a longhouse, with the Seneca characterized as keepers of the western door, the Mohawk as keepers of the eastern door, and the Onondaga as keepers of the central council fire. Leaders chosen by clan mothers from all 5 nations came together in a grand council at Onondaga to discuss all matters of common concern, especially issues that threatened the entire confederacy. Now, to give some context for warfare that was taking place in the 17th century, since the beginning of this century, several nations, including the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Innu, Miami, and Illinois, as well as the French, had been at war periodically with the Haudenosaunee. This era of history is sometimes referred to as the Iroquois Wars or the Beaver Wars. By our time, though, in the mid-1680s, the Haudenosaunee and the French had been at peace and even on friendly terms for about 20 years. They had signed a peace treaty back in 1667. The French, however, were watching with growing concern as the Haudenosaunee made wars on their allies and trade partners to the west, like the Illinois and Miami. And thus the French began planning a war against the Confederacy. For their part, the Haudenosaunee also watched with concern as the French began expanding military posts and trade posts throughout the Great Lakes region and down the Mississippi Valley. The choice to take captives as galley slaves was not a spur-of-the-moment decision by Governor Denonville either. This is something that had been in the works for a number of years as letters from the French court to the colonial officials in New France attest. As early as 1684, a letter from the French king reads, and this is the first quote on the slide here. It reads, quote, "As it concerns the good of my service to diminish as much as possible the number of the Iroquois, and as these Indians are stout and robust, will, moreover, serve with advantage in my galleys, I wish you to do everything in your power to make a great number of them prisoners of war, and that you have them shipped by every opportunity which will offer their removal to France," end quote. We see similar orders repeated in March of 1688 after Denonville sent the initial captives to France. Basically, Louis XIV, the French court, ordering that Denonville capture more Haudenosaunee captives to send to France. A French ship carrying the Haudenosaunee docked at Rochefort on France's Atlantic coast at the end of October 1687. The intendant of the marine at Rochefort, a guy named Pierre Arnoul, oversaw their arrival and transportation to Marseille. We have confirmation from Intendant Arnoul and from other sources that exactly 36 captives arrived on French soil. And this map, which I guess I didn't really make it, but I added the locations, shows you where Rochefort is on the Atlantic coast and Marseille on the Mediterranean, as well as Paris, the administrative capital of France, where the orders would have been sent from to these two port cities. And the Haudenosaunee would have been sent overland from Rochefort to Marseille. And I'll touch a bit more on this later. But I also want to introduce a number of French actors, historical actors, who end up playing a larger role in this narrative. First, we have Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Seignelay, and this is actually the son of the more famous Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the prime minister to Louis XIV. So historians usually refer to this younger Jean-Baptiste Colbert as the Marquis de Seignelay to distinguish him from his father. He was the minister of the Navy and the colonies and oversaw all things related to Canada and New France in this era. So he plays a very large role. Second, we have Michel Bégon, who was the intendant of the galleys at Marseille from 1685 to 88, and he was responsible for the Haudenosaunee captives while they were at Marseille. Third, we have Yves Laurence, who was the royal chaplain of the galley fleet, who oversaw converting the galley rowers to Catholicism, which plays a very large role in this narrative, the conversion to Catholicism. This is a preoccupation of French officials from Paris to Marseille. The king's galley fleet were simultaneously fighting ships as well as penal establishment meant to reform convicts and captives. And part of this reformation was this conversion to Catholicism. So turning now to Marseille, to the port, around this time, Louis XIV possessed a fleet of over 50 galleys manned by more than 15,000 men, which included aristocratic officers, galley chaplains, soldiers, and oarsmen, of course, who formed the bulk of these 15,000 men. And just to cover all my bases here, a galley is a low, flat ship that relied mostly on oars for propulsion, that was used in warfare, trade, piracy in the Mediterranean Sea mostly, and the use of galleys dates back as far as antiquity. So they were quite actually outdated in this time period. This was the age of sail after all, but galleys still had some uses, and Louis XIV found it important enough to actually build a galley fleet in the 17th century. The naval base for the galley fleet was established in 1665 at the behest of Louis XIV, and it was meant to build and maintain the galleys, manufacture and dry cordage, forge cannons and anchors, and just generally bolster the international reputation and prestige of the French crown. In addition to defending French coasts against piracy and participating in maritime campaigns, the galley fleet served as symbols for Louis XIV as a self-proclaimed protector of Catholicism in the Mediterranean through both his enslavement of quote-unquote infidels and through his wars against Ottoman and North African adversaries using galley ships. There were two categories of galley rowers in the 17th century, and I'll talk about them on this slide. We have the forçats, or the convicts, and the esclaves, or slaves. So to begin with the slaves, they belong to a broad administrative category of purchased or captured rowers, usually Muslims from North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean, but also occasionally sub-Saharan Africans bought in Cape Verde or Senegal. Forçats, or convicts, belong to a separate category of usually Frenchmen serving sentences for various crimes, including Christian heresy. In fact, the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which made Protestantism illegal in France, swelled the convict rowing force by imprisoning Huguenots, that is, French Protestants, who were unable to flee France or who had refused to convert to Catholicism. Jointly, forçats and slaves rowed alongside each other and collectively served as unfree labor for the galley fleet. We'll explore this in a bit, but the Haudenosaunee were classified as slaves. But as more is found out about them, this is questioned as well. So we'll return to this idea of convicts versus slaves in the galley fleet. Before arriving at Marseille, the convicts and captives had to undergo a long and difficult journey. Chained together in heavy irons riveted around their necks, the captives were forced to march an average of 20 kilometers a day. There were three principal routes that these, what were called chains, or chains of convicts and slaves, took to arrive at Marseille to serve in the galleys. The Haudenosaunee captives would have followed or traveled on the Guyenne or Bordeaux chain that followed the Garonne Valley southeast as far as Toulouse, and then reached the Mediterranean from there. You can see a plausible route that they would have taken on this very helpful map from historian Paul Bamford's book, Fighting Ships and Prisons, from the 1970s, all about Louis XIV's galley fleet. This has been a fantastic work that has helped me contextualize what is actually going on with the galley fleet and the rowers on that fleet. Given the lack of adequate clothing, shoes, and provisions, as well as the severe mistreatment by their conductors and guards, most chains of prisoners that converged on Marseille had suffered significant casualties. So even the journey there would have been one of the more difficult ordeals of this period of servitude and slavery. So now that we've actually reached Marseille, I want to share some of the information that I was able to uncover for how the Haudenosaunee, what that experience would have been like. Most of the recorded information surrounding their activities deals with both their dietary and spiritual nourishment, quite literally what they were eating and whether or not they were converting to Catholicism or if they were already Catholic. This is what the records speak to the most. In late 1687 and early 1688, Minister Seignelay wrote several letters to Intendant Bégon regarding how he was to care for the newly arrived captives, which seems to have been at least somewhat more lenient than the treatment afforded to other galley rowers. For example, a letter on December 18th has the minister writing, and I quote, His Majesty wishes that the Iroquois are not chained, provided you are certain they are secure and will not escape, and that they are not to be shaved. But with regard to bread, His Majesty did not think fit to increase the bread ration above that of a forçat, or convict, which is considered strong enough to support these Iroquois, end quote. In just over a month after their arrival, however, the rations of the Haudenosaunee captives were increased, following petitions by officials at Marseille to the minister. On January 15th of 1688, Minister Seignelay wrote to Yves Laurence saying, quote, "The king was good enough to have considered the request you made of me for the Iroquois, and I indicated to Monsieur Bégon to increase the ration," end quote. So in just a few weeks, the conditions for the Haudenosaunee captives seemed to have improved, however, marginally. The image on screen, which I have attached, is because it's related to rations and feeding galley rowers. These are orders for how many rations should be distributed to rowers when they are on campaign. So this is from the same archives where I found most of my information. Turning more directly to conversion, the conversion of galley rowers, especially enslaved non-Christians, to Catholicism represented a significant spiritual victory for the French king. So their survival was deemed paramount if this spiritual victory were to be used to enhance the king's image and reputation. For example, in August of 1681, the La Majeure Cathedral in Marseille hosted a group baptism for 50 enslaved West Africans who converted to Catholicism. And in recognizing this, the French crown spared little expense in providing extra clothing, a more robust diet, a dedicated interpreter, and indoor accommodations heated by fire during the winter months. Like the enslaved West Africans, the Haudenosaunee captives also received significant oversight by crown officials who took intense interest in both their religious salvation and physical adaptation to the Mediterranean port city. For these reasons, Minister Seignelay ultimately agreed that, quote, "these Iroquois need stronger food than usual," end quote. So I wondered then if corresponding baptisms likewise happened for the Haudenosaunee captives in Marseille. So far, I've not been able to find any, but it may be because they already professed to be Catholics, at least some of them did. And we'll get into this more on the next slide here. Mentioning that some of the Haudenosaunee professed to be Catholic is something that started to come up for the royal chaplain Yves Laurence, who had been primarily charged with converting them in the first place. Some of the Haudenosaunee galley rowers were already familiar with Christian doctrine, having been exposed to Jesuit and Sulpician missionaries for decades in North America, especially around Montreal, as well as on the north shore of Lake Ontario. A letter in the French archives attests to this familiarity with Christianity. It says, and I quote, I was very glad to learn from your letter of the 1st of this month that the Iroquois have some tincture of our religion, and that they indicate that they have been baptized. You will have less trouble giving them instructions you deem necessary. I write to Monsieur Bégon not to put them in chains or shave them, so that there will be no objection to your work. But it is necessary that you observe that your zeal and your charity do not go too far and don't treat them too favorably, end quote. Well, the minister cautioned Intendant Bégon and Yves Laurence not to treat the Haudenosaunee too favorably. It seems that they were treated somewhat better than their fellow galley rowers. I've mentioned the higher bread ration. They did not have their heads shaved, and they did not have to sleep chained together like other galley rowers did. The head shaving was a particularly degrading act portrayed here with shocking violence in an 18th century painting of galley slaves embarking at the port of Genoa by Italian artist Alessandro Magnasco. As a sign of infamy and for the sake of hygiene, so to prevent lice outbreaks, for example, galley slaves lost all their hair. But this does not seem to be the case for the Haudenosaunee captives, at least as multiple letters in the archives seem to attest that they were not to have their heads shaved. Sorry, the top of the slide is cut out, but it says the Haudenosaunee reception of Catholicism. One of my arguments is that probably what aided the Haudenosaunee captives was that they professed knowledge of Catholicism, some even indicating that they had been baptized. Others may have allowed galley chaplains to baptize or confirm their devotion to Christ by receiving the sacrament of Eucharist during Mass. Evidence from the official correspondence again states that, quote, the Iroquois frequented the sacraments with the devotion that they owed, end quote. Meaning, at least in my interpretation, that they would have received communion and Mass. This fact may have given some French officials pause that the Haudenosaunee were wrongly imprisoned, or at the very least misclassified as slaves. Religion was the basis for distinguishing between convicts and slaves aboard the galleys in the 17th century. This was prior to the emergence of hardening racial and ethnic categories to define slavery throughout the French Empire, which would come later. Slavery aboard Louis XIV's galleys was reserved for infidels, non-Christians, and usually referred to Turks, North Africans, or West Africans. Back in North America, Haudenosaunee had interacted with Christian missionaries for decades. Some had converted, others hadn't, but still dabbled in Catholic prayer, ritual, and material culture, like crucifix pendants and rosary beads. The image on screen depicts a scene at the Jesuit mission of Sault Ste. Louis, also called Kahnawake, in the 17th century. This is a Christian Mohawk community near Montreal, and Kahnawake is still a Mohawk community near Montreal today. Either way, the spiritual flexibility, or what I call, at the very least, religious pragmatism, shown by some of the Haudenosaunee at Marseille might have been a helpful strategy to improve their condition. Another question I asked myself, so you can see this is early in a research project. I'm still asking lots of questions as I visit the archives and look for things, and sometimes nothing is forthcoming. And this is somewhat true with the next slide. Was whether or not the Haudenosaunee captives were forced to participate in any maritime campaigns during their time with the galley fleet at Marseille. One would imagine, yes, they would have, but perhaps not. They were there, after all, for a very short amount of time. Sorry, I knocked that mic a bit. Thank you. Thank you. I was like, that might not be good. Okay. So there would have been a limited window for campaigning for the galley fleet, since storms and winter winds usually kept the entire fleet back at the harbor from really October to the end of April. So the only full summer campaigning season that the Haudenosaunee were present for was that of 1688. And one notable action did happen that summer when French Marshal Jean d'Estrées led a fleet of 31 ships to bombard Algiers in North Africa. And this action is pictured on the screen here. Relations between France and the North African states like Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco were always difficult. And this friction sometimes erupted into declarations of war. The Barbary corsairs, that is the Muslim pirates and privateers from North Africa, targeted French merchant ships in the Mediterranean and raided French Mediterranean coastal settlements. Just as enslaved Muslims rowed French galleys, so too did enslaved Christians row in the galley fleets of North African kingdoms. The Marshal d'Estré's fleet consisted of sailing ships, bomb ketches, and combat galleys for close-range fighting. D'Estrées spent the first 2 weeks of July shelling Algiers with not only cannonballs, but also explosive shells, which greatly damaged Algiers and its fortifications, but not enough to make them capitulate to the French. So it was somewhat of an indecisive campaign. And by the end of July, d'Estrées' fleet had returned to Toulon and Marseille, respectively. Marseille was the base for the galleys and Toulon for the sailing ships. I'm hoping that further research in France, especially in the south of France, might help me determine if Haudenosaunee were present for this particular campaign. I mean, if not, they would have been back at Marseille, but it's unclear still where they would have been deployed to. I want to return now to North America to discuss how some of the Haudenosaunee captives eventually made it back home. And I think for that, we have to look to other members of the Confederacy who were agitating and advocating for the return home of their relatives who were imprisoned in France. Immediately following Governor Denonville's raid, the Haudenosaunee began ramping up their attacks against the French, essentially capturing French men, women, and children in retaliation for the taking of prisoners to the Mediterranean galleys. When Father Jean de Lamberville, who was the resident chaplain at Fort Frontenac, attempted to negotiate for the return of some French prisoners, Haudenosaunee leaders sternly replied that they would not return their prisoners until the French had returned their relatives home from overseas. Haudenosaunee warriors also commenced a 6-month siege of Fort Frontenac, and without being able to leave for fresh provisions and water, scurvy slowly and painfully killed off the French garrison. The situation was not much better at Fort Niagara to the west, where scurvy had struck down 100 soldiers, including the commandant Pierre de Troyes. The Haudenosaunee were deliberately targeting Fort Frontenac, as one Mohawk diplomat vowed to the English of New York, quote, that the place where the French stole their Indians 2 years ago should soon be cut off, for to steal people in a time of peace is an inconsiderate work, end quote. Robert Livingston, a New York official, wrote in September of 1687 that, quote, we have news from Oneida that the Indians have taken more French prisoners. I am afraid they will burn the French prisoners. They are so exasperated, end quote. Increasing Haudenosaunee attacks in the aftermath of Denonville's invasion and sending to France of the captives were beginning to act as an incentive for the return of the Haudenosaunee captives. We have another, strategy to have relatives returned. In June of 1688, so the following summer, Outre-Outy, an Onondaga leader who the French called La Grande Gueule, or Big Mouth, I'll call him Outre-Outy here, he approached Montreal with a large contingent of Onondaga, Oneida, and Cayuga warriors. Panicked French officials sent a Jesuit, so the same Father Lamberville who had barely survived the ordeal at Fort Frontenac the previous year. They sent him to negotiate with Outre-Outy. Diplomacy succeeded, and nearly 100 Haudenosaunee entered Montreal unarmed to negotiate with the French, but their much larger army stood at a distance ready to attack if the negotiators were maltreated. The Haudenosaunee had every reason to be suspicious of the French. The meeting resulted in what's been called the Treaty of Neutrality, where Outre-Outy and 21 other Haudenosaunee leaders placed their signatures on a document signifying their intention to observe a perfect neutrality between England and France. To mark their intentions, Outre-Outy and his compatriots drew their clan signatures on the treaty document, which you can see on the slide here. The poor quality is on account that this is a scan of a microfilm copy of a document in France. By entering Montreal and placing themselves at the mercy of the French, the Haudenosaunee negotiators risked a great deal to advocate for their brethren who had been captured the previous year. As Father Lamberville observed, quote, their desire to get back their compatriots who had been treacherously put in irons and taken to the galleys in France caused them to take this measure and risk themselves upon the word of the governor and ours, end quote. The Haudenosaunee delegates under Outre-Outy also squeezed a major concession from the French, the return of 91 captives held at the La Montagne mission. While the 36 Haudenosaunee had been sent to the galleys, many of the women, children, and elders that Governor Denonville had captured were dispersed throughout Christian missionary communities closer to Montreal, like La Montagne and Sault Ste. Louis. So the return of these 91 captives was indeed a diplomatic victory for Outre-Outy and the other leaders. They had indeed redeemed some of their relatives who were in French captivity. A third strategy I want to touch on. Oh, sorry, this is just more. This is the English translation of the Treaty of Neutrality. We can maybe return to this later. So here we go. So meeting with New York officials. So this is the third strategy that Haudenosaunee leaders did to get their relatives back home. We see them meeting several times with Governor Thomas Dongan of New York to ask for his help in recovering prisoners in French custody. I have a quote there from a Mohawk representative basically saying, and I'll just read it quickly, quote, the governor of Canada hath begun an illegal war upon us without any provocation or cause. He throws his axe everywhere and exercises acts of hostility upon all people without respect of persons, end quote. After sort of denouncing the governor of New France, governor of Canada, Haudenosaunee delegates then produced a list of names of their most prominent leaders who had been sent overseas to France, hoping that the English would be able to effectuate some results on their behalf. When Edmund Andros replaced Governor Dongan in August of 1688, the Haudenosaunee were quick to reiterate their concerns for the galley slaves, complaining that they had not heard any news of their people who had been sent across the sea. Around this time, an Onondaga leader named Haudenosaunee sort of emerges as taking a leading role in advocating for the return of their relatives. He addresses the governor of New York, referencing that, quote, several of our Indians who were stolen by the French in a time of peace and sent prisoners to France, and therefore we desire you to write beyond the sea that we may have the same Indians back again, end quote. Haudenosaunee then presented a wampum belt with 28 sticks tied to it to show the number of their relatives that had been taken overseas by the French. So he is sort of implying wampum belts, this diplomatic device utilized by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and other people, and he's tying sticks to it to sort of signify the number of people they want to see returned. For their part, both governors of New York, Dongan and Andros later, made a concerted effort to redeem Haudenosaunee prisoners in French custody, writing several times to the government of New France after their initial meetings. Dongan demanded the return of all Haudenosaunee captives held by the French in either Canada or in France, and dozens of letters were exchanged between New York, New France, and their respective metropolitan governments regarding the exchange of prisoners. So I think this is very fascinating that we can see Haudenosaunee leaders willing to put negotiations for the return of their people, at least partially in the hands of the English governor of New York, who they knew would have been in communication with the governor of New France, as well as the English king overseas. We get now to this moment where we do, in fact, see the return of some of the Haudenosaunee galley slaves. Largely in part to the increasing Haudenosaunee military pressure, and perhaps also in part due to diplomatic pressure from the government of England and the province of New York. Once it was decided to return the Haudenosaunee captives, a list was drawn up. This is a unique document that provides the names of 21 of the galley slaves, presumably all those who had survived the ordeal up until that point. You can see from the list of names here transcribed along with the original document from the French National Archives on the right, that I was fortunate to consult last April in Paris. So I think more research is left to be done on these particular names to try to identify them, to maybe try to connect them to hereditary leadership. We know that the Grand Council of the Confederacy, all of those titles were hereditary titles that were passed on. So there is this effort underway that I hope to do to cross-reference hereditary names with the names of the 21 galley slaves. On May 9th, 1689, the Haudenosaunee captives left Marseille with their escort bound for Rochefort, which would, from there, they would again cross the Atlantic to return to Canada. Unfortunately for the captives, this isn't quite the end of the story. Orders were sent to officials at Rochefort to prepare for the arrival of the Haudenosaunee. Some of this concerned how the Haudenosaunee were to be treated, how they were to be dressed. As you can see from the two quotes here, to dress them well without spending a lot of money was the desire of the minister Segnelet. But the last part of the first quote I find interesting is that it says, quote, "His Majesty is very happy to use these Indians to make peace with those of their nation, not being appropriate to continue the war in this present situation," or in the present situation, end quote. I think this is a clear indication of France's war weariness and desire to end the conflict with the Confederacy. So while the Haudenosaunee captives may have been given, some nice but maybe not very expensive clothing, they were not able to depart from Rochefort immediately. There was difficulty in securing crews for the ships. There were contrary winds, so they had to wait around a little bit. And unfortunately, this does lead to at least one Haudenosaunee falling sick and dying at the Royal Naval Hospital of Rochefort on May 31st, 1689. And this is a hospital death record, which indicates that, quote, "An Iroquois having been brought in very great danger of dying to the Royal Hospital of Rochefort, and having given us all the signs of being a good Christian, we administered the sacraments of penitence and extreme unction," that is the final anointing of the sick, "to him on the 31st of the month of May, 1689, he died the same day and was buried the 1st of June, end quote. So far, this has been the only evidence I've been able to find for a Haudenosaunee death and burial on French soil. But we know that there were certainly more, for only 13 out of the original 36 would return home to North America for the first time in over 2 years in October of 1689. So what had happened to the other captives? Contemporary French observers give us some indication. The Baron de la Hontan, who was a French military officer, who was actually very critical of the arrest and imprisonment of the Haudenosaunee, wrote that, quote, "Governor Frontenac brought back only some of these Iroquois that Monsieur de Denonville had sent to the galleys, the rest having perished in their chains," end quote. So not very specific, but certainly he is attributing their death to the condemnation to the oar. Father Lamberville, who I had mentioned before, was also very critical of Denonville's actions, and he wrote that, quote, "They were carried away to France, where they died from destitution, except 13 who were brought back because their compatriots were going to avenge this treachery," end quote. So another clear indication that it was the Haudenosaunee raids that effectuated the return of the captives. It is likely that the Haudenosaunee captives perished from various disease epidemics that circulated throughout Europe in the 17th century, the same diseases that killed so many indigenous peoples in North America, like smallpox, influenza, scarlet fever, and measles. So this brings us to the conclusion. On one hand, this is a very terrible story where the French caused a lot of suffering towards the Haudenosaunee people. It begins with Governor Denonville leading an army to invade their homeland. But before that even happens, he arrests and imprisons hundreds of people. Of those prisoners, he selects 36 men to send to France to labor in the galleys of Louis XIV for 2 years. Of that number, only 13 eventually make it back home to North America. That being said, one point I do want to emphasize is that I think this can also be a story of Indigenous agency and resistance in the face of French imperial power in the late 17th century. In Marseille, we see how the Haudenosaunee prisoners may have utilized familiarity with Christianity to carve out better conditions for themselves, better rations, more comfortable accommodations, not having their head shaved, and so on. Back in North America, we see, I think more importantly in North America, we see how actions taken by the Haudenosaunee, who advocated for the return of their enslaved brethren overseas through several means. They captured the French to hold as hostages in exchange for their own people. They besieged the French fort where their own people had initially been taken captive. They appealed to the government of the province of New York to intervene with the French directly, and they even sent peaceful delegations to Montreal to negotiate with Governor Denonville and see if he could be reasoned with. These strategies seem to have worked and resulted in the eventual return of at least 13 of those who had survived their ordeal overseas. Some of the redeemed captives, like the Cayuga leader, Uehuhare, whose career I also examine in this project, went on to play a pivotal role in Franco-Haudenosaunee diplomacy, which eventually culminated in the Treaty of 1701 in Montreal, the Great Peace of Montreal. Another important goal of this project will be to situate Haudenosaunee history in a wider Atlantic or global context. And this case study of the Haudenosaunee galley slaves provides but one of many examples of Haudenosaunee traveling through different indigenous homelands, colonial empires, and across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe and back, which I hope this project is able to unpack more fully. That is all I have. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to having questions, discussion. Thank you. Should I? I can handle the questions. Okay, sure. Okay, great. Yes.
You must see so many parallels as you dig into this and you look at our contemporary world and you see hostage taking and the bargaining and the giving and taking of captured people. Which way are you learning from watching today's news and overlaying it on your look at history? Does it work for you more the other way around?
That's a really good question. Oh yes, okay. the question was if looking at sort of contemporary hostage taking, negotiation, exchange, sort of conflict in the 21st century context, if that informs how I study the past. I think is a good summary. That's a really good question, and I guess to admit fully, not especially. It is interesting to see these parallels and examine these parallels, but really I am trying to look at it in its 17th century context to make the most sense of it. I will say this: I've been working very closely with Haudenosaunee community in a contemporary context, and I think that's given me maybe a lot of insight into the past, maybe more so than contemporary conflicts. And to learn more about how Haudenosaunee traditional governance would have worked, what the Grand Council leadership and hereditary chiefs, sometimes called condoled chiefs, how that would have worked, and lessons about, I guess, like peace and culture that we sort of see at work. This idea of rapprochement and even though there is this horrible conflict, there is this desire of the Haudenosaunee to eventually reach peaceful terms with the French and their other enemies. So It's a bit of a rambling answer, but I guess I am trying to be informed less so by sort of contemporary conflicts and more so about Haudenosaunee, that Haudenosaunee cultural context that I think is still very present in our world today. So thank you. Thank you. Oh, there's a question at the back, and then maybe we'll go to the front. So we'll go to the back first. Hmm. So the question was, did I consult the Jesuit relations in Paris? And so I actually the Jesuit relations are very accessible. They were all published in the late 1800s, early 1900s by a Wisconsin historian named Reuben Gold Thwaites, 71 volumes, published with the original French and Latin on one side and the English translation on the other. So that's the version I've been consulting, and to be honest, it's the version most historians of New France consult. It is still possible to see well, it's kind of tricky because the Jesuit relations were published back in their own contemporary times, right? So you can consult the published editions of them from the 1600s, let's say, if you were to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. So they are very accessible still, even in that original form. And in addition to that, they're actually digitized as well. So you can consult the Jesuit relations in a number of ways and in a number of languages. So yes, very accessible source. And that's where I get a lot of the stuff from Lambertville, who I was mentioning. The follow-up question is, does Queens have access to these versions? And yes, they do. The Jordan Rare Books and Special Collections, I believe, has a number of volumes. I don't know if they have all 71 volumes. And you also, just looking through the Queen's library system, you could access all of them digitally as well. So very accessible for both professors and undergraduate students. I'm happy to report. Thank you. And question.
Sorry, you mentioned that you've been working here with, or I don't know, where is it that you are working with some of the Haudenosaunee?
Mm-hmm.
And are they aware, who you're working with, are they aware of their history? Are they learning it from you, or do they have any way of knowing what's happening and things been handed down?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So the question was if I could, I guess, provide more context for the Haudenosaunee group I'm currently working with. So it's a group called CLEAR. It's Cataraqui Longhouse Education Archival Research. So that's the acronym, and it works out to CLEAR. And it's a local group. I would say it's a community-based research initiative, maybe would be the best way to describe it. They very graciously have invited me to attend meetings and participate. I'm the only non-Haudenosaunee member, so I feel very, very honored to be included. They do. One of our members is Al Dockstader from. He's elder in residence at Queen's University, actually, and he's a knowledge keeper, and he shared some stories about people being taken overseas. So I think this cultural memory, is still very much alive within Haudenosaunee Six Nations community today. And I'm also happy to be able to share documents that I was able to find in France and to share the translated version with them as well. Even Haudenosaunee communities in Quebec tend to be primarily Anglophone, which surprised me, but as I got to know more folks from Ganawage, just south of Montreal, mostly English speakers, and they speak their own language as well too. So I've been very, in a way, I feel like I owe it to these communities to bring what I'm able to find in France and translate into English and share it. So I think it is. I mean, my aim is that it could be a reciprocal relationship as well, and I could make accessible documents that weren't accessible. So today, all the quotes I showed, I've translated those from French. Well, unless it was like from the New York officials, then that was in English originally. But yeah, so no, it's a great ongoing relationship, and we had a symposium actually about a month ago that we held at the Marine Museum actually, and that was we had some members from CLEAR present their research and the projects they're working on there. So it's great that I can work on this project sort of independently, but we're all kind of working on our own projects and we're sharing and we're collaborating and we're consulting. So for me, it's been a really fulfilling relationship. Thank you. Oh, yes.
You mentioned the Louis XIV's fleet in the Mediterranean, also included the North African slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can set the context of this episode of slave taking
Mm-hmm.
In the context of slavery, not only worldwide, but more especially in North America, and possibly between different warring tribes of indigenous peoples.
Okay, so that's a great question, and so the question was, could I guess provide greater context for slave taking, slavery in both the Mediterranean and looking to North America as well, like interindigenous slavery, which was extremely prevalent in this time period. So to begin with the Mediterranean, so the bulk of the slaves in the galley fleet of Louis XIV would have been classified as what the French would have called Turks. They could have been from the Ottoman Empire, but they were likely also from Algiers, Tripoli, Morocco. The French would capture them in raids, but they would also purchase them at places like Malta from the Knights of Malta. So there were active slave markets in the Mediterranean, and the French were able to justify slavery through the fact that these were non-Christians. I mentioned too that Christians rode in the galley fleets of the North African kingdoms. This is true, but it diminished over time as the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted more into the hands of Europeans, like the French, like the Spanish, like the Italian city-states, who more and more sort of possessed a technological advantage over their North African adversaries. But looking at, let's say, like the 1400s or 1500s, you might have had a more balanced amount of Christians in slavery as you would have had Muslims in European fleets. Turning to so yeah, definitely the majority of the enslaved galley rowers in the French fleet would have been Muslims. Looking towards North America though, and interindigenous slavery, wars of capture were fought by the Haudenosaunee against their enemies. It looked a little differently though than European slavery. One historian, Dan Richter, has called this the mourning war. So mourning as in like you're sad. So for example, if a relative were to die, clan mothers could assemble the young men and sort of order them to go on a raid against their enemies. The captives from these raids would then be adopted and incorporated into Iroquoian village life, and they would take the place of a deceased relative through this mourning war ritual. One of the more famous examples is the French fur trader Pierre Esprit Radisson, who was captured by the Mohawks when he was a young boy, and he underwent this mourning war ritual. He had been captured in a raid by the Mohawks. His friends he was out hunting with were killed. They were put to death, but he was chosen to be adopted, and he was given an Iroquois name, and he was adopted by the Mohawks. And he lived with them for some time. He did eventually escape, though. For the most part, though, the Haudenosaunee targeted similar people who were culturally and linguistically similar to them. So you might have heard of the wars between the Iroquois and the Hurons, right? These are both Iroquoian people. They have a similar language, similar belief system. They both are sort of semi-sedentary, practice agriculture. So it was quite easy for Huron women and children to be incorporated into a Haudenosaunee or an Iroquois village. So that's the context for the Haudenosaunee. It's quite different if you move further west too. Brett Rushforth, a historian back in 2012 wrote a book called Bonds of Alliance, where he compares French Atlantic and indigenous sort of continental slaveries. And he looks at groups further west, like the Dakota Sioux, the Fox or the Mascoutin, and a number of other Anishinaabe groups like the Ojibwe and Odawa. And it was a little different for them too. He argues that slaves sort of occupied a lower status in some of these Algonquian societies further west. So it wasn't the same across the board, but at least for the Haudenosaunee context, there wasn't really a slave, but rather a captive to be incorporated into village life. Oh, sure.
Yes, the question online was just concerning the Haudenosaunee claiming Christian version.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that they were claiming these beliefs simply to get better treatment? Is there any evidence of that?
Do I need to repeat this question? Okay. So the question from online was, to what degree were the Haudenosaunee claiming Catholic beliefs to receive preferential treatment during their time at Marseille? And yeah, I do throw around the word religious pragmatism, which is maybe my suspicion. But there's no documents that shed light on this sort of genuine level of belief, and I don't think this will be possible to fully know. I can speak to the Haudenosaunee sort of reception of Catholicism in North America, which seems to have been, I guess you could call it, somewhat syncretic or culturally hybrid. Historians like Alan Greer, who's written on the Mohawk Saint Gadari Degawida from Ganawage, he argues in his book that Haudenosaunee were quite willing to accept, Christian faith, but they also would turn to more traditional spiritual practices as well. And this was true for the Huron-Wendat also in the 1630s and 40s when they interacted with the Jesuits. These were very, not to generalize, but I think a lot of indigenous spiritualities were very sort of open and receptive to outside spirits, like the Manitou, right? The spiritual world was sort of robust and varied, and it was, why not incorporate Christian prayer, ritual, material culture into sort of this repertoire of things one could do to improve hunting, to cure sickness, to improve one's prospects in war or in love and marriage, right? So they were quite willing to experiment with these different beliefs. It was more the Jesuits who were very against this, right? They wanted sort of this monotheistic belief in Christian doctrine. So I think a lot of Haudenosaunee would not have been opposed to Catholicism. They would have been more opposed to relinquishing their pre-existing belief system. One of the Haudenosaunee I look at, I refer to him at the end, Ure Huhare, a Cayuga leader. There is every indication he continued to live as a Christian up until his death in 1698. He was given a Christian funeral in Quebec, and he was a former galley slave. So we know at least one of them. And actually, I'll go back on my slides here. So Ure Huhare, his name is spelled differently in a lot of places, but he's the second to the bottom, starting with an A, Ari Uwe, and then you see Baptiste Jean. So I don't know if it's like a Jean Baptiste was his Christian name, or if it's baptisé, that they just didn't put the E accent aigu, baptized as John, or as Jean Baptiste, or Baptiste Jean. So he's the only one on this list who seems to have a Christian name attached to him. Another interesting name I'd point out here too is there's the third name on the left column, Katarokwi. So very similar. Well, I think we could say it is the same spelling, contemporary spelling of this place here. of Cataraqui. So
I actually had a follow-up question about the individual in Cataraqui.
okay.
I guess, have you found their final fate? Did they manage to return safely to North America?
So the question is about the individual Cataraqui, of whether this was one of the 13 that made it back. To be perfectly honest, it's actually been very difficult to track the name of the 13. No indication so far. We know Urehuhare. There's another guy. There's another former galley slave named Cohank, Cohank, whose name does not appear on this list. But it might be the top of the right column, Kaha, just without the K. So once again, spelling of names is not standardized. The French and English seem to spell the names of indigenous leaders in wildly different ways. So this has not been an easy archival inquiry, but I am truly hoping to find out more information about this. Thank you. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Did the British or the French enslave indigenous people for use by them within North America itself?
Yes, that's a really good question. If the question is, did the British and French enslave indigenous peoples for use in North America? Yes, absolutely. I guess I'll speak more to the French context, but maybe to start, there was a large indigenous slave population in the St. Lawrence Valley. I mean, comparatively to the small population of the French habitants, settlers. Most slaves in New France had been captured in war and traded to the French by their allies, right? The French had this vast alliance of indigenous allies, including Anishinaabe people like the Odawa, Ojibwe, Mississaugas, Potawatomis, as well as the Illinois and Miami, the Wendat. Anyway, to name a few, but there were dozens and dozens of indigenous nations allied to the French. There was an event known as the Fox Wars, where the French fought a people they called the Foxes, the Renards, people who call themselves the Meskwaki. Anyway, this war was fought in the 1710s and 20s and 30s. And during this war, hundreds of Fox slaves made it into French hands. Similar wars were fought against the Dakota Sioux, and women and children and young people of those nations also became slaves in French households. So there was domestic slaves. There were slaves who worked kind of in the dockyards, sometimes on like small farm labor. Some slaves were even voyageurs. We have evidence in voyageur contracts that have survived from the 1700s of indigenous peoples being sort of who were enslaved indigenous peoples sort of being farmed out as voyageurs to work for the canoe brigades. Likewise, there was massive indigenous slave trade in the American Southeast, particularly the Carolina colonies and Georgia. Massive amount of indigenous slaves in that area east of the Mississippi. One historian has called this a shatter zone, where for indigenous peoples, there was little choice: either become a slave raider or become a victim of other slave raiding nations. So the situation was even much more grim when you look to the American Southeast. Alan Galley has written a lot on this subject.
In terms of that trade, was there any sense of the monetary exchange for slaves?
Mm-hmm.
What was the going rate for a man or woman, child? Was there ever any repatriation in terms of buying them back?
Mm-hmm.
Into the example here of the 13 who came back,
mm-hmm.
was there an exchange of funds to massage that coming back process?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the question was about sort of the financial context of the slave trade. the indigenous slave trade and the repatriation. Yes, thank you. and whether or not repatriation happened, like we see in this context, and if for repatriation to happen, funds had to transfer. So this was a big issue for the Fox Wars, as well as the wars fought against the Dakota Sioux. The French wanted peace with the Fox at one point, but the Fox said, "How could we come to the bargaining table with you if you have so many of our children and our women as slaves?" And then the governor said, "Okay, fine, we'll redeem the captives." But it becomes very tricky, because how do you force the colonial elite, the wealthy merchants, to give up their property? I hesitate to give an exact or to put an exact number to it, but I guess I would say I would fall back to maybe Brett Rushforth and Marcel Giraud, who've written about, Marcel Trudel, who've written about slavery in New France. But I think you'd be looking at maybe a slave could be worth up to like a year's salary of a voyageur, let's say. So it would not be affordable to sort of the working class folks of the colony. This would have been for the wealthy merchants, the colonial officers, the governor general of New France at this time had several indigenous slaves in his household. In fact, we get to this era where there's pressure to return Fox slaves, and what was discovered in the notary records was that the word Fox was often crossed out, and a different indigenous nation would have been put on there to try to sort of hide the fact that Fox people were enslaved. Brett Rushforth found this out when he did work on his book, that Renard crossed out in Pani, which has sort of just become a generic term, Pani or Pawnee, become a generic term for an enslaved indigenous person in New France. For this particular instance, I don't have any evidence that for these 13 that any money would have been exchanged, because this was sort of slaves to the French crown and not an individual. But I think the expectation would be that, if you were going to return an indigenous slave owned by an individual merchant or wealthy aristocrat, that yes, they would have to be compensated. And I do believe they were in cases where Fox and Dakota slaves were returned home. But yeah, that's a really good question, because this was a large financial concern.
Yes, we take them back across both ways.
Yeah.
They had to be fed,
Yeah.
and somebody paid the freight, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as the quote shows, take care to dress them well without spending a lot of money. So even when it's the crown funding this, they are still trying to economize, and save if they can. Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of interested on the flip side of it. No, they're not in the French for any long period of time, but nevertheless, a year, 2 years, it's quite a bit of time, and especially having traveled through the area of France, on land, quite a bit away. I was kind of curious as to whether there's any evidence from the French community or French presence of recognizing who these people are and learning from them, or just a genuine interest in who they are in terms of people, or because they're really completely different. They would never, chances are they've not come across anyone coming from North America that you would be aware of.
So thank you. So question from Michelle about I guess the French public perception of Haudenosaunee in France. I have to say I've not found any evidence. One thing I have tried to do, or will want to do, is trace that route that I showed in that one slide from Paul Bamfort's book, and see what towns they would have went through, and then maybe it would be possible to look into the individual archives of those regions and see if any evidence comes up. It's a difficult task, but it's actually quite a narrow chronological window. So for example, when I found the hospital death record at Rochefort for the one Haudenosaunee that died, I didn't have to look through that many because I knew they were there in this from the spring to the summer of '89. So if it wasn't, if nothing, because nothing else appeared. So once I got to September, I'm like, well, the ships have left, so there's not going to be any more evidence. So to actually trace the sort of local archive for the route they would have taken, I think it is actually a viable thing to do, even though it is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. To speak about the French public's reaction, the only, I guess, public-facing document I've been able to find, there was a French periodical that was published called Le Mercure Galant, and they published a short article about the Denonville's campaign, how he burned down the Seneca villages, burned the corn, and that some Haudenosaunee were being sent to France. It actually said 50 in number, which was an exaggeration. But this was the only sort of public news regarding this, which would have circulated in Paris and perhaps elsewhere in the kingdom. But yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to add on to that, sort of the reactions of the French public. I mean, indigenous peoples had been visiting France, and it was a spectacle very early on. When you look to the 1500s, there's this sort of famous instance in the city of Rouen, which was connected to the Atlantic trade, where about 50 Brazilian indigenous people were there, and a sort of a stage was set to make it look like a village from Brazil. So there was 50 sort of actual Brazilian indigenous peoples, and then about 250 French in costumed and sort of painted in that style. And there was this big celebration for that time. So yeah, as early as the 16th century, then there was sort of the spectacle in France. I mean, similarly, when Jacques Cartier visited the St. Lawrence Valley, he brought back several of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians he encountered. He brought them back to St. Malo and then to the French court. So yeah, indigenous peoples had been sort of say like paraded around France, a few times already. So by the time we get to the 1680s, I don't know if we could say the novelty had almost worn out. Yeah, I think so. I think that it would have still left an impression as they would have traveled. So
treated in a slightly different way.
yeah.
But that, yeah, that reacts way back and how much community, not community, but interaction
Yeah.
might have been with the community there while they're waiting for the ship.
Absolutely. Well, and I'll add on to that too. So the following year, in 1691, I found evidence of a Iroquois in France who was passionately desirous of seeing the armies of His Majesty, was sort of how the archival document quoted it. And I was like, well, who is this Iroquois who's come to France, who wants to see the army of Louis XIV? So I'm still trying to follow up on this. Who was this? Because it seems very strange. Like a couple years before, you have people forcibly taken from North America as captives, and then a couple years later, you have a sort of a diplomatic envoy in France all of a sudden wanting to check things out. But there were the more Christian Mohawks at this time who lived near Montreal, like at places like Ganawage, like I was talking about, and also La Montagne. So you do have some more pro-French Iroquois, which is a very sort of generic and broad term. Yeah, more investigation to be undertaken. Oh, okay. Oh, couple. Oh, sure.
You mentioned that they got to keep their career.
Yes.
Do you know for a fact why? It's a bit contradictory after culture. Here it's very culturally important.
Mm-hmm. So the question was about if I knew why they got to keep their hair. I guess short answer, no. the, what the documents suggest, just based on the context, is that it is about trying to give them preferential treatment, trying to put them in a more comfortable position, trying to keep them, I guess, in that French camp. But yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there too about the context of hair, the importance of hair. What does hair mean to a Haudenosaunee warrior? These men would have been young men in their prime. They would have been warriors, because that there wasn't really a separate class of warriors. It was just sort of an expectation, especially at a time of war. They would have participated in this. So I think that's something I need to flesh out to give that cultural context for both the Haudenosaunee and sort of Catholic context as well. So thank you. We'll go here.
Have you been able to take on some multilingual talents with this study of words?
So the question is about if I've been able to take on multilingual talents. So I guess short answer is no. I was fortunate to grow up and sort of go to school in French. So this is something I've had. I've had to keep working on it because I do live in a pretty much completely Anglophone context. But being able to sort of read it and translate it, I mean, that's an ability I still am able to do. So it's not too difficult going to the French archives. As far as Gaingeha, like the Mohawk language, or any of the other related Haudenosaunee languages, I don't have any capacity, but I am at least trying to learn how to pronounce things correctly. K's sound like G's, and T's sound like D's, for example. So trying to get the linguistic side of it down at least. But yeah, more work to come. Thank you. So we'll go here and then.
Before I finally brought that back up, I felt really upset reading the last part about a few ribbons and braids would please them. And it's just so salient looking at how they dehumanize people as if they didn't have any they obviously had great sophistication.
Yeah.
For, great intelligence, and not really, says so much.
Yeah.
And the other question I had, sorry, my mom too, was how did you originally become interested in all of this? This isn't something you learn at school or what we do today.
Yeah. So the to begin with, how did I get interested in this? I'll answer this first. It was really from moving to Kingston, and when I started my position at Queen's in 2019, I was hired as an assistant professor in the history department. I have my sort of PhD is in French Indigenous relations, but I've been primarily interested in Western history. I guess my first Nautical Nights talk was an indication of that. I looked at sort of west of Lake Superior. That was my region. But since moving here, I've becoming more interested in the Eastern Great Lakes and just learning the Indigenous history of this area and knowing that the Haudenosaunee captives were held here at Fort Frontenac. This is where this sort of treacherous coup of Governor Denonville happened. Was right by the Leon Center or Slush Puffy Center.
Don't even go there.
So it was right here. So I think the power of place, right, is what really sort of drew me to this story in the first place, knowing that there was such rich and interesting and horrible history associated to Cataraqui. Of course, one that way predated this being a British place as well. And then maybe just to speak to the first question comment was about this sort of condescension of saying a few ribbons and braids will please them. And even before that too, it says to dress them properly and caress them a little. So this idea that the French are really trying to appease these these poor hostages, these poor captives that they've done really terrible things to by giving them some, tokens of goodwill. Yeah. And I'll say this too. Ure who I study, he's a bit of an enigma. He does seem quite attached to the French, but he's also moving back and forth between the traditional homelands and New France, trying to secure peace. Some of the other redeemed galley slaves, most of them not named in the sources, are quite disgruntled by their experiences. Kohank, who I mentioned, complains to the English about how they had been treated. Another one actually kills some Christian Mohawks when he's out hunting with them, and then flees back to the traditional homeland. So they're not too happy with the French and French allied nations. Yeah. Yes, sir.
My interest or focus was on the life expectancies here, because when you say the number that were sent as slaves in 13 came back,
Mhm.
and time period, considering the conditions on, one would assume, on the galleys, and the lack of protection, I guess is the word, from the North Americans into the European context for disease.
Mhm.
But I'm actually surprised at the number who survived in that context. I assume the rest must have died because of disease in that process.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So to repeat the question, the question.
Comment more than
About the life expectancy in indigenous Americans and sort of a European, disease-filled context, especially in the galleys, the sort of hardships associated with the galleys as well, and especially the chain that march to the base at Marseille would have been really difficult. So yeah, the question of, kind of amazing that 13 even did survive is remarkable. I guess I will say this. I mean, there is a chance that some of these Haudenosaunee men had, as children, been exposed to and survived epidemic diseases, which we know were ravaging Iroquois in the 1650s, 60s, and obviously caused massive population destruction. It's estimated that probably about half of the Iroquois Confederacy died in this era, from about 20,000 to 10,000 people. So it could be that someone like Ure was a survivor of smallpox and thus would have been granted immunity for life. This was actually the case for Europeans as well. These were just diseases that were endemic in European cities. So if you survived to adulthood, to your 20s, chances are in Europe in the 17th century, you would have had scarring from smallpox, right? And maybe half your siblings would have died from it. By this time, it could be that it would have been maybe safer for an Indigenous American to be in a European context disease-wise. Of course, it's impossible to prove, but I guess I could theorize it. And then even once they return to North America, they still die pretty suddenly. I mentioned Ure. He dies in 1698. He would have been in his 40s, maybe 50s. He would not have been that old, but this was the danger of living in a pre-modern world for Europeans and Indigenous peoples alike. Yeah, I guess 50s was getting up there in the 17th century. But yeah, it varied. A lot of it was luck and just avoiding sickness and disease, because there wasn't really much one could do. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thanks, everyone. You want to have a closing thought? Yeah.
So thank you again, Scott, for coming here this afternoon, or this evening, I should say. Thank you. And thank you again for everyone who's attended and watched along all of our Nautical Nights presentations. This concludes our 2024 iteration of the Nautical Nights. So once again, thank you to all of our speakers and all of our participants for giving us your time and giving us your expertise on your different subject matters. The next major event for the museum, just to remind you, will of course be the opening of Keewatin and tours aboard that vessel. And we hope we shall see you again at the Great Lakes Museum for that wonderful new addition to our waterfront. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Out of the passing, the final thought actually, Scott referenced XIV Haudenosaunee, one of the exact context, but one of the indigenous people, no, French, captured by the indigenous people in one of the raids. There was actually a presentation about him a couple years ago by Mark Corey that you're more than welcome to go and listen to because they're all live streamed on our YouTube page. If you're interested, you can take a couple years back and have a listen, and also go and take a listen to Scott's presentation a couple years ago. So, there you go. You got your plans for the weekend sorted out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.